For pump storage, this is a resource that you can cycle over and over and over again with little to no wear on the system for generations.
There's obviously a lot of high demand for the wind, the solar, the batteries, but as you mentioned, not everybody wants that. And certainly when it comes to having it in your own backyard, the conversation starts to change a little bit. Welcome to DAM, the official podcast of Northwest Hydropower. I'm your host, Austin Rohr, and I manage all things communications here at Northwest River Partners. Today, I'm excited to share that our guest is the Vice President of Rye Development, Erik Steimle. Now, quite frankly, I could have prepared a flowery statement about who Erik is and what he does, but I don't think it'd do it any justice. So, Erik, in your own words, who is Rye Development and what's your background there?
Great. Thanks for having me on this morning, Austin. Rye Development is one of the leading platforms in the United States for the development of new low impact hydropower. Uh, I have worked for Rye for just a little more than 7 decades, sorry, 7 years. And my background before coming to Rye includes more than 2 decades of new hydropower development here in the U.S., including the last new major hydropower project that was constructed here in Oregon. I'm based in Portland, Oregon, and that hydro facility was a new hydropower project that was constructed on an existing non-power dam, a flood control facility just south of Eugene, Oregon, and it's been online and providing power to the southern portion of the Willamette Valley for almost a decade now.
Yeah, it sounds like a pretty interesting gig. It sounds like something that maybe not many people out there would be very familiar with if they're outside of our space being in energy. So maybe for me, but really for the folks listening, can you explain to me what exactly pump storage is?
So hydro pump storage or pump storage facilities are energy storage systems that move water between a lower reservoir and an upper reservoir. Water is released from an upper reservoir and then used to turn hydroelectric turbines to generate electricity before being collected in a lower reservoir. And then, it's returned to the upper reservoir to repeat the process. When the energy used to return the water is from wind or solar, pump storage serves as a carbon-free, pollution-free source of on-demand power. And the types of pump storage projects that Rye Development proposes are what are referred to as closed-loop pump storage projects. That just means that we're not using an existing water body, river, or existing reservoir for the purposes of the project. We're building 2 new artificial reservoirs or ponds on the landscape and moving water back and forth between the two based on the demands of the grid. So pump storage facilities are the most common form of energy storage in the U.S., and they represent currently 93% of all the utility scale energy storage, according to the U.S. Department of Energy's recent stats. Pump storage, of course, it's a proven and available technology that can help reduce greenhouse gas emissions and, of course, our dependence on fossil fuels.
Right, right. And so in that sense, it differs quite a bit from, say, traditional hydropower that people might be familiar with, where, as you mentioned, there is no river, there's no dam. And so in that sense, maybe you can touch on not only what the reason for a technology like pump storage is, but also get into a little bit of the idea of using pump storage as a means of energy storage versus generation.
Yeah, great questions. So without a massive amount of additional energy storage capacity, we can't bring more renewable energy resources onto the power grid, which is needed to meet Washington, Oregon, and California's 100% clean energy mandates. And of course, the West Coast is not the only place in the US now transitioning away from fossil fuels. The two biggest sources of renewable energy that we've been constructing in the last couple of decades are primarily wind and solar. So these are variable resources, which means that they produce electricity really only when the sun is shining and, of course, when the wind is blowing. And sometimes the generation from wind and solar facilities really isn't available when it's needed. So pump storage projects like what Rye is developing allow energy generated from wind and solar resources to be stored and then used when the demand is highest. And specifically in Washington and the greater Pacific Northwest, storage facilities will be necessary to replace retiring fossil fuel-based electricity that previously could be relied on to keep the lights on, when renewables were not available. So, traditional hydropower in the Pacific Northwest is largely responsible for reliable, on-demand, but also carbon-free electricity, as you well know. And as we started adding wind and solar into the system, a couple decades ago, the existing hydropower fleet could be used to balance that intermittency. But we're well past that point. It's been that way for a decade plus, and we've been relying more and more on natural gas to balance these intermittent resources. But as we actually try and transition away from fossil fuel use, reliance on natural gas, to bring balance into the system and provide reliable electricity will need to go away, and we'll need to rely on energy storage. And pumped hydro or hydroelectric pump storage is by far the lowest cost, most reliable form of energy storage.
Right. And so that kind of gets us right into my next question, which is you touched on the wind and solar aspect and the need for being able to store that energy. Why use pump storage as opposed to, say, a traditional battery? And I don't mean, for anyone listening that's less familiar with the topic, I certainly don't mean something like your double A's that I had to put in the recorder we're using this morning, or the battery you recharge in your device, right? I'm talking about a battery that would take up, essentially, to my understanding, an entire warehouse. I mean, something like, if you can picture the size of a Costco being filled up with just battery cells. That would be our traditional wind and solar battery, right? So why go with pump storage as opposed to one of those?
Yeah, those are great questions. And certainly there's going to be a variety of energy storage that the grid needs to rely on. So, lithium ion batteries, for instance, will still be an important function, but they won't be the types of batteries the grid will be able to rely on for resource adequacy or really providing large amounts of power, renewable power on demand. So, a recent E3 study showed that the Pacific Northwest is going to require 5 to 15 gigawatts of new storage for renewable energy in the next decade. And this need is based on popular demand that pushed the policy or renewable energy goals that we now have in Washington, Oregon, and California. So when you think about 5 to 15 gigawatts, that's the equivalent power generation that would need to come from building, 2,000 to 6,000 new utility scale wind turbines in the Pacific Northwest. Additionally, if that 5 to 15 gigawatts of new storage capacity were built relying entirely on lithium ion battery technology, which is, arguably the technology that most people are familiar with, it would require close to 800,000 acres of land, or an area that would essentially be the size of the state of Rhode Island to support that type of storage. So the majority of pump storage that Rye is developing are these closed loop pump storage projects. The major project features on the landscape are an upper and lower pond, and these are approximately 60 acres in size. So, from a land use perspective, pump storage in areas like the Pacific Northwest, where we have the geography and the geology to support this type of storage, it's a no-brainer from a cost-benefit standpoint. I mean, there are large portions of the U.S. that will have a much harder time relying on energy storage and citing low-cost energy storage to provide reliable, on-demand, carbon-free electricity.
Yeah, and that really kind of glides right into where I wanted to go here, and I also appreciate you kind of putting into scale, into context, the amount of energy we're talking about when we're talking about that significant number of gigawatts. I mean, normally when we're talking hydropower, even here at River Partners, we're talking in terms of like megawatts. So a gigawatt, for those that wouldn't be familiar, is what is it, like is it 1,000 megawatts?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So I had to do a little bit on the fly there, but um, yeah, it's a significant amount of energy in terms of what we need to be able to store, be able to produce, be able to make available, and especially as we continue to electrify and decarbonize. You also touched on something that I think is really important, though, which is that land use question. What are some of the drawbacks or challenges to trying to implement pump storage? And maybe you even can compare, as you kind of already alluded to, how that aligns, or how that compares to the land use and siting challenges for some of those other resources as well.
So on the siting side, pump storage is a little bit of a disadvantage compared to other energy storage technologies and other renewables because it's federally regulated. It's an older type of energy resource where the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is responsible for the permitting and compliance for these types of projects. The positive side of that is that while it's long or a long and comprehensive process, you're certain as you complete that process that you really have a project that is beneficial to not just the local community, but the region. What I will say, though, is that to build a lithium ion project or other types of storage projects, in many places, these are projects that can be constructed and just built out in a matter of months with zero public input on whether or not this is really a good deal for the community or ratepayers. A lot of these types of storage projects that whether it's lithium ion or other technologies, these are facilities that have to be completely replaced every 15 or 20 years, and ratepayers are on the hook for those replacement costs. When you compare that to pump storage or hydro that has a lifespan of well over 100 years, you don't have to explain to people in the Pacific Northwest that those are the projects that allow us to have some of the cheapest, not only renewable, but cheapest electricity in the world. So, those are some of the drawbacks on the siting side. From a land use perspective, I'll refer to the Goldendale energy storage project that Rye is developing in Washington State with Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners. This project is a 1,200 megawatt pump storage project and will be able to provide electricity to power 500,000 homes in Washington State for up to 12 hours per day. So similar to my previous comment, the two major components of this project that you'll see on the landscape in Klickitat County are two 60-acre ponds. So to put that in perspective, again, building a 1,200 megawatt wind project would require 7,000 acres of land, and 1,200 megawatts of solar in Washington would take more than 50,000 acres of land. So those are renewables compared to storage. So if you had to do, compare apples to apples with storage, the equivalent and necessary grid storage in comparison to lithium ion for Goldendale would require more than 1,000 semi-trailer sized batteries in the regions connecting to the transmission system running through the Columbia River Gorge. So again, from a land use perspective, pump storage has a lot to offer in providing, real reliability to the grid, on-demand carbon-free electricity to help enable solar and wind in our system, and to do so in a cost-effective and equitable manner for ratepayers.
Well, I think so far you've pretty much sold me. But And I think you have really listed a lot of them. Are there unique benefits to pump storage? I mean, obviously, as you're touching on the whether it's the land use, the lifespan, some of the different capabilities, but are there certain things about pump storage that offer a really unique benefit that you just wouldn't get maybe from really any other form of storage?
Yeah, I mean, before we get into sort of the multi-use component of it, which is being contemplated by pump storage developers in other places in the U.S. Rye's projects
Mm.
are really just focused on being resources for the grid and the shift towards decarbonization of our grid. But I think the one benefit that people don't talk about too much on the with pump storage is, thinking about and this ties into the lifespan comment a little bit, but cycling. So, you know, if we if we charge our iPhone, for instance, you're only going to get so much, use out of that particular battery, right? Before, it needs to be recharged. And we all know my phone's a few years old at this point. It needs to be charged more and more
Right, right.
to
That advertised battery life.
to keep using it. So, in
Yeah.
the storage world, that's what we kind of refer to as cycling. And most of the battery technologies that are out there, and some that are just in the pilot or discovery form, really have some limitations on lifespan due to cycling, which is obvious. We obviously experience that with our batteries. So for pump storage, this is a resource that you can cycle over and over and over again with little to no wear on the system for generations. And so that's what allows these types of projects to really be the workhorse of the grid to provide on-demand renewables at relatively low cost long term. The other component of pump storage is that it does allow for additional water storage, and of course, not just in the West, but in large areas of the U.S. There's more and more planning around water storage for a variety of purposes, but needing to retain water at least seasonally, or if not longer, for a predictable delivery of water for various municipal or other commercial needs. So, pump storage is also being looked at as sort of a component of a water storage system where it can provide some benefits to the grid, but also be a source of water storage for other commercial or municipal needs.
Yeah, definitely. And that really was my next question. When we talk about hydropower, there's a lot of secondary benefits, things that maybe weren't the intended purpose of putting a dam on the river, but we've certainly been afforded some extra benefit as a result of doing it. I could, some of them were truly put in for flood control, but you could name flood control, navigation, recreational benefits. I mean, the list goes on. For pump storage, it sounds like there's quite a bit of secondary benefit with the ability to store water as well. And are there within that some benefits that you see from your perspective that pump storage could offer? I mean, one that comes to mind certainly for me is the idea of being able to maybe suppress wildfire and having water available to pull from those reservoirs or those pools when needed to be able to say take in with a helicopter and dump on a fire line. And obviously our fire situation has gotten pretty bad here on the West Coast in the last couple of years. But yeah, I mean, talk to me about what some of those secondary benefits are that pump storage can offer.
There's for the projects that we're working on, some of the benefits secondary include access. So a lot of our project lands are private, and so there are various parties looking to access these areas for, I would say, minor recreation purposes. The pump storage projects we're proposing don't provide on-water recreation. I think on-water recreation is something that most people think about when they think about hydropower. But again, infrastructure that's providing resiliency in the system. You mentioned fire. and the ability to be a resource for fire. These are some of the considerations. I would say pump storage, specifically closed loop pump storage, like we're proposing, does have some limits for multiple use because the footprint is so small. These are relatively small features. They have a lot of power and a lot of benefit to the grid, but building a couple of 60-acre ponds on the landscape, it doesn't take up a lot of space, and it certainly doesn't, define large areas of the watershed in a way that some historic hydro has.
Hmm. And that's something too that sometimes I think people maybe hear the a figure like 60 acres and they think, "Whoa, that's pretty big." I don't know how I feel about that. But as you're explaining it to me, does it start to do you ever see the wheels start to turn as you explain this to folks out there who are maybe a little bit hesitant towards pump storage, that hey, we can accomplish quite a bit in a relatively small amount of space when you consider the alternatives?
Yes, absolutely. And that's an argument that's front and center across the United States now. It's not just limited to the coasts where there's been a lot of renewable development, especially solar development, has been pursued across the U.S. And more aggressively now in places that didn't have solar, 5, 10 years ago, like the southern portion of the United States, the Mid-Atlantic, and other areas. So people can see the landscapes changing and just how much land it takes to support intermittent renewables like wind and solar. And so, the ability to provide a grid resource, provide storage, with a pump storage project with really a limited footprint in comparison to how much land it takes to meet our electricity demands with wind and solar, it really resonates. And I provided a few examples today, but people can actually see those examples on the landscape.
A bit more of an in-depth question for you here, but one that I think is necessary to discuss. What are some of the concerns when we do talk about grid reliability and intermittent resources as we, start to phase out some of those carbon emitting resources? What are some of the concerns or challenges that we have overall when it comes to ensuring that we can maintain grid reliability and prevent things like blackouts?
Yeah, for I would say that the biggest concern overall is how we make the shift. And there is a variety of opinions, whether you're a ratepayer or a utility or a county commissioner on, how the shift should occur, and who should essentially pay. Like, what is an equitable way to make the shift, so that our grid is reliable but also carbon free? And I think for a lot of people, when we talk about, equity, that isn't, solar panels and an electric vehicle necessarily in your suburban home. It's, being able to have access to low cost, renewable electricity on demand in a reliable way. And so, utility scale projects that are able to do that at a broad scale, really, again, provide low cost benefits to the grid for generations. And so that's the type of project that pump storage is and the benefit that it brings. I would add that, our region, in the Pacific Northwest, but more broadly across the US, the grid is going to go through its, biggest change in the next decade, since, the modern invention of what the grid is today, or how we talk about the electrical grid. And there's regions where a lot of the new concerns and planning are around electric vehicle use. There's as our transportation sector becomes more and more tied into our electrical grid. Then of course you have areas of the Mid-Atlantic and southern portion of the United States that have their eyes on the bulk of the manufacturing that's coming home, the manufacturing that's being encouraged as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act and other incentives. I mean, these are areas that are, you know, proposing to build the majority of the lithium ion batteries that are going to go in our electric vehicles. So they need a massive infusion of electricity. And with coal coming offline, you know, you're going to need a variety of renewable projects, but also storage projects that can really provide large amounts of bulk electricity on demand. So, you know, those are some of the challenges, and certainly hydropower is by far, you know, the low cost, resilient form of electricity and electricity storage that every state can point to as a real benefit in their system.
Certainly, and I think it's important, you know, as we look at that future. There's obviously a lot of high demand for the wind, the solar, the batteries, but as you mentioned, not everybody wants that, and certainly when it comes to having it in your own backyard, the conversation starts to change a little bit. So essentially, I think where we're in alignment, and I think a lot of people listening will be in alignment, is that it's good to have the options. It's good to have a lot of variety and variability so that we're not just locked into essentially a very narrow set of resources moving forward. One other thing I want to touch on a little bit on that subject is this idea of hydropower and pump storage and where they sort of cross paths. You know, hydropower being more generation focused, but being able to certainly store some energy in the sense that there's a reservoir that can be, you know, water can be held back to a certain extent. Obviously, when you're talking about a run of the river dam versus a dam that would have more of like a traditional reservoir, there's some differences there. But in general, you are able to do some amount of energy storage, and then pump storage being, you know, more focused on the storage aspect than the generation aspect. Where do you see opportunities for these two forms of hydropower to be leveraged together to our advantage?
Yeah, it's a great question. We could spend our whole time talking about this, and I think the reasons actually align for the most part across the United States. So, uh, you know, we can touch on Oregon, which is, you know, obviously where I sit, and talk about low cost hydropower from all these types of various types of hydropower resources. So, as you know, I mean, Oregon continues to be mentioned as one of the best states in the press to own an electric vehicle,
Mm-hmm.
or for new manufacturing to be cited due to the low cost, and more importantly, for many commercial entities now, not just low cost, but the fact that the power is largely renewable. That story is built on hydropower. And to maintain this, ratepayers in the Pacific Northwest, you know, that we talk to for sure, certainly see the value in new pump storage as an additional component of this as we add in, you know, wind and solar as well to get to 100% clean. You know, this, like our legacy hydro, these are assets that last 100 plus years. And as I touched on earlier, versus other storage technologies like batteries that need to be disposed of every decade or so, with ratepayers on the hook to pay for something new as a replacement. And, you know, that story resonates across the US. It's being discussed in real time. And, you know, I'd also argue that hydropower to a large extent has bipartisan appeal across large areas of the US, if for not other reasons, the reasons that I just touched on.
Certainly, and we hope it continues to retain that bipartisan appeal moving forward.
The other thing I would mention too, and is that the electricity market in the United States is balkanized, it's fragmented, and even more so, you know, it's been picked apart into a variety of areas because of individual state or and sometimes even individual municipalities that have different goals around renewables. So, you know, that can make it a little bit messy, but also it allows for real market signals in broad areas of the US now to come from the private sector on the types of energy that they would like to buy. And, that was something that, was really in its infancy, 5, 6, 7 years ago, but didn't exist, 10, 15 years ago to a large extent. And so a lot of these buyers now are focused entirely on ensuring that their electricity for manufacturing or retail or, a variety of the electricity needs that a company has are a 24/7 and localized source of renewable electricity. And you can't get to a 24/7 type of electricity or power purchase agreement with just wind or solar or even solar plus storage. So that is where hydropower is really playing a role. And that's a relatively new market, I would argue, for hydro, at least in certain portions of the United States.
Mm-hmm. You bring up a really good point with that, and it also it brings me back to something you said just a few minutes ago as well. Hydropower is pretty well implemented in terms of our traditional hydropower, our dams. I mean, there is a conversation to be had about powering facilities that are not currently generating electricity but are otherwise, being used as a dam on a river. But we're not going to be building any new Bonnevilles or Grand Coulees anytime soon on, like the Columbia, for example. I mean, those systems are pretty well flushed out, and we will certainly be upgrading the technologies like the turbines and, being able to make those more efficient and generate more power as time goes on. But, we're not building new dams. We are building out a lot of these intermittent resources, as you mentioned, wind and solar being the most popular by far. It begs the question: what needs to come first? It's a like chicken and egg discussion, right? Do you need to build out the pump storage ahead of time, or do you bring the intermittent resources into the equation and then try and figure out the storage question second? I'm sure that there's nuance to that, and it's not totally cut and dry. But what is the sort of most important thing to implement first here in order to make this big change that we're talking about?
That's a great question. And when people think about energy storage and renewables in general, they oftentimes think of California. They, of course, passed some of the early, really aggressive renewable standards, or areas along the West Coast. And those areas really focused on new wind and solar first, and we'll figure out storage later. You have to remind yourself, though, that is a situation that was allowed in part by a lot of existing low cost and reliable hydropower that was already in the system, that could balance the load, or the ability to rely on new natural gas, right, to balance the system. So, that's how it's looked, at least on the West Coast. In some areas, it's been similar. But I would say across other portions of the U.S. that, from a renewable standpoint, are further behind the coasts, or elsewhere across the world, there's a larger focus on the storage or reliability aspect first, before, a massive outlay of intermittent renewables on the wind and solar side. So, and one could also argue in a lot of cases they're doing both simultaneously, because reliability, especially in systems across the U.S. where coal has been the majority of the source of electricity, that's an on-demand type of resource. Obviously, there's challenges with coal, but as those systems start to come offline, in areas of the Mid-Atlantic and across the U.S., there's a firm focus on reliability, that pump storage and hydro can provide first, and sort of blending the renewables second. So hopefully that answers your question.
No, I think it does, and it does really highlight how complex the issue is, right? You can't just say, well, we need to build our storage now and then build our intermittent resources once those projects are complete. Or, as we look to California, certainly people want to be critical of some of the things that they've done with their energy policy, because you see, big headlines like we had last year where they had to send out alerts to everybody and have people reduce their power usage in order to avoid blackouts. But they are kind of the canary in the coal mine in terms of making this shift. And so I think that we do owe them maybe a little more grace than they're often given for the fact that we're learning as we go here a little bit. We'd like to think that everybody has everything figured out all the time, but that's not always the case. And sometimes you have to see how things are implemented to understand where changes and improvements need to be made in order to bring this nationwide. So it is, I mean, it's certainly a really important discussion to have, and it does highlight that it's going to be different for every community, for every state, for different regions. I mean, certainly even the challenges between the East Coast versus us, is quite a bit different. Where people might think of the West as, or at least the Northwest, as being very wet and rainy and everything, but you don't have to go very far east to hit the high desert where that's definitely not the case. So it really is. It's an interesting. It's an interesting thing to try to wrap your head around. And I think it's great that we're having this discussion, because I think a lot of people out there that are outside of, our own industry, so to speak, are going to be learning about a lot of this for the first time. The next thing I really want to start looking at is, from your perspective, what needs to be happening next in order for pump storage to be implemented? And what needs to take place for some of this technology to make its way into communities and into regions where it's not already being implemented?
So, one of the challenges with pump storage is that it does take a while to site and construct in comparison to, other types of storage resources. Uh, but because it is such a solid technology and really offers a number of advantages, there's lots of investment coming into the space, and certainly willing investors to pursue development of these types of projects. The- What it would be helpful, though, is uh, more market signals, and I guess just less balkanization of the electricity markets, and how renewables are treated across the U.S. That's easy to say, and one thing that's been a really good signal, especially over the last 3 or 4 years, is that more and more of the United States is aligning around renewable goals, and how renewable energy needs to be integrated in as a reliable source of power into the grid. So as larger portions of the U.S. align on renewables, that sends a market signal that allows more of these types of storage resources to be pursued. And you know, with that, the well, I guess having an understanding of demand as well. A lot of utilities at this point are seeing some major changes. So if you consider our projects in the Mid Atlantic, for instance, some of these areas were hollowed out decades ago from a commercial electricity use standpoint. A lot of manufacturing went overseas, and that's all coming home. And it's been pretty recent that those shifts have changed, and so you see utility planners, regions really seeing a massive upswing in electricity demand, especially over the next 5 years on the manufacturing side, and then added to that, an upswing in electric vehicle purchases and the transportation sector being more aligned with the grid. So, good planning, getting a real sense on what our regions are going to need as far as, future electricity needs, and understanding that those needs are largely going to come from renewables, a significant portion of those renewables being intermittent.
Right, right. You bring up a few interesting timelines. One of them being the sort of changing of hearts and minds in order to get some of these projects moving. And as you know, and we're very aware here as well, you don't change hearts and minds overnight, certainly. And then on the other hand, you have a very rapid development when it comes to electrification, decarbonization, and like the legislative movements behind that, as well as some of the folks that are just pounding the drum of, hey, let's shut down the coal tomorrow, let's get moving, let's get this green energy thing going. But one other thing that you brought up, and I'm curious to know a little bit, maybe from a broad perspective, what this looks like. What is the timeline for a pump storage project typically look like? Because that is an important factor to consider when we're talking about making these transitions that we are going to need to make. But certainly there are things we can't rush into and flip the switch to tomorrow.
For the most part, pump storage projects that are being proposed today, closed loop projects like Rise, they are an 8 to 10 year effort from conception through the date which the commercial operation begins, which is quite a bit of time, especially given that a lot of the renewable goals across the US now are showing large amounts of decarbonization, if not trying to be 100% carbon free by 2040. So 2040 seems like a long time from now, but for these projects to actually be constructed and realized in the grid, that requires a lot of upfront work today. So those are potential challenges. But I would argue that there's a lot of capital coming out of oil and gas at this point, looking for renewable projects, but more importantly, grid resiliency projects that are going to provide storage or actually integrate renewables in a way that utilities can use the resource as a tool to provide on-demand carbon-free electricity. So that's a great change, and it's a change that I think ratepayers and utilities are well positioned for, to a large extent.
No, and it's very exciting to hear as well, because ultimately, if you don't have that kind of support, you're certainly at a pretty great disadvantage. And it is great that that support is coming online, and I think it's moving and accelerating at a pretty steady rate, which is really great. So for Rye specifically, what are some of the projects that you're currently working on, and what would those mean for energy and economic development?
Yeah, great question. So we have 3 projects that we're pushing forward on in the U.S. in various stages at this point. So the first project is a 400 megawatt pump storage project in Southern Oregon called the Swan Lake Pump Storage Project. It is scheduled to begin construction just about 12 months from now. So it's fully permitted, and the project is over $1 billion infrastructure project, providing thousands of new jobs during construction in Klamath Falls, as well as a large new tax base and a number of permanent family wage positions when the project goes online. Our second project in the Pacific Northwest is a project in Klickitat County, Washington. It's a 1,200 megawatt pump storage project, considered the cornerstone of Washington State's renewable energy program. And this project's in the final stages of permitting, and it's expected to finish permitting in late 2023, early 2024, and is slated for construction in late 2025, early 2026. Both of those projects have entered into agreements with the building trades. So these will be union-built projects, providing opportunities for apprentices to gain experience and actually become journeymen, all at the same project. So, obviously, retirees and attrition is happening across many sectors, but it's real in the building trade. So having these types of projects come into the picture and offer the ability for the building trades to attract new apprentices, and all the while being able to work and gain experience to become a journeyman at one project site. Those types of projects are pretty rare these days. So those are our projects in the Pacific Northwest. We have a project in Southeast Kentucky, a 300 megawatt pump storage project. It's being located at a former coal mining site. So we are repurposing or redeveloping an area that has it's been quite a while, essentially, since that particular area has provided any sort of economic resources or jobs to the community. We're repurposing it into this pump storage project as a project that will really help Kentucky integrate renewables and make the transition away from some fossil fuels there as coal retires, and the state really focuses on a lot of new manufacturing jobs that are coming to Kentucky.
That sounds pretty awesome, and I imagine that's going to perk some ears up at home for the people listening. As far as some of those jobs go, and some of the apprenticeships that you're mentioning and everything like that, how would somebody interested in an opportunity like that maybe get involved?
So as part of the FERC licensing process, we are responsible for hosting a number of public meetings, in the communities adjacent to the projects. So that's the best way to get involved. We're really good at engaging the Chamber of Commerce, the local economic development organizations, which vary place to place. And those groups always have some connection with the school district, and in recruiting, especially high school age individuals, into the building trades. One thing that is important to point out with the building trades is that apprentices get paid while learning on the job. So these are the job opportunities, even at an apprentice, where apprentice wages often are double or triple what the going wages are for most high school graduates in these communities. All the while they're on a path to gaining a skill, and earning real family wages once they're done with that program as a journeyman. The building trades in the individual states offer their own training programs, right, that are left up to the trades in that state. But again, there's active recruitment going on in the building trades. They're looking for young people to join their ranks. So, it's not too hard to get involved. If there's specific questions at a project level, each of our projects have a project website. So the Lewis Ridge project, the Goldendale project, and the Swan Lake project. Anyone that's interested in employment or a connection to the trades there that would be interested in these types of positions can reach out directly on those sites.
No, that is fantastic. And I know that certainly those are industries that, we could have a much broader discussion that would probably take up a whole other podcast about the demand for new faces in those industries, and for that labor force seeing some excitement out of the younger generations and whatnot. So that is really really tremendous, and I think something that just further adds to the benefit of pursuing things like pump storage. That being said, not everybody is going to be ready to get their hands dirty and get to work on building these facilities. And I'm sure there will be people that are very excited about pump storage that maybe want to support it in other ways. Are there things that people can do outside of the actual economic, or I guess job opportunities that that they can do to get involved, that they can do to maybe help these projects move along? I mean, is it something that you touched on, I think, like chambers of commerce? I mean, should people be writing into the members of those chambers and asking them to support pump storage or consider it, or are the different actions that people at home can take to advocate for what projects you guys are doing?
Yes, absolutely. So there's obviously a few things you can do. So the project we have in Southern Oregon is fully permitted and moving towards construction. But there's certainly ways to get involved there locally. The project plays an important role in various activities and organized events, right, where people can engage uh, in the project, and there'll be more on that front once the project moves into construction. Projects that are still in permitting, there's a number of ways to get involved. The state permitting processes, the federal permitting processes all have public participation requirements. So comments or being at a public meeting and just speaking about it, all of those things are important in the process to actually, get projects permitted and ultimately get them realized. And then, you mentioned it, Chamber of Commerce, other local economic development organizations. I mean, they are actively trying to, secure projects that have sustainable jobs in their communities long term. And so these projects are just those types of projects. These are projects that essentially become a backbone of the grid. So the permanent employment there is not something that can be offshore.
Mhm.
So those are important things for um, groups like the chamber and other county organizations. These are a large new source of local tax base, and so a lot of organizations in a local area support pump storage or these types of renewable energy storage projects because it's a large new source of tax base on the one hand, but it also doesn't require this area to double their police force, or other sort of things because it is a relatively small impact on the landscape while providing you know uh, a fair number of new permanent jobs, but not something that disrupts some of the services the county or area already offers. And then just
Absolutely.
good old fashioned, writing to your elected officials, the federal delegation, the governor's office. I mean, these are individuals that are very focused on, especially in the states I mentioned, on getting to a non-carbon grid. But in doing so in a cost-effective way that also, allows their state or region to suggest that reliability is of utmost importance, and we can make the transition to a carbon-free grid in a reliable and cost-effective manner for everyone.
Amen to that. And so with that being said, for the people that are listening to this podcast at home, that's your homework assignment coming out of this. Whether it's something in terms of getting involved in those job opportunities or whether it's writing in. I mean, Erik, it can't be just you and I that are excited about this for these things to move forward. We need everybody to get on board, and we need as many advocates as we can get. And I think particularly if you're in one of these areas, whether you're talking about Klamath Falls or Klickitat, certainly I can't speak as much to Kentucky. I'm not as familiar, admittedly, but those are communities that I think could really benefit, particularly from this sort of expansion of opportunity. We're not talking about big urban centers when we're talking about these places, and so this could bring a lot of development and a lot of prosperity to the people that live there. So, yeah, if you're listening, get involved. Well, I think we're getting down to the tail end here. So I do have a few wrap up questions I want to throw at you. The first one here: what takeaways would you like the listeners of this podcast to come away with from today's discussion?
I mean, the main takeaway is that hydro pump storage, particularly in areas like the Pacific Northwest that have a lot of existing hydro, and that hydropower is important part of the low cost carbon free grid. I mean, this is just a low impact extension of that, right? This is a new type of homegrown energy storage that we can rely on for generations, and we don't need to rely on other types of energy storage as much that have foreign supply chains, or other complications, not to mention, a short shelf life that we'll have to pay for again in the near term. So I think that's one of the important takeaways. I think the other is that, you know, and I, and for the most part, a lot of stakeholders understand this, is that there's some patience that's required for these types of projects. We undergo a permitting process that's unlike anything else in the renewable space, compared, in comparison to wind or solar or other types of batteries. But there's a benefit in that, everyone deserves to be heard, every stakeholder group, every individual that could be, touched by these projects, hopefully positively. But in some cases, there are some impacts to building anything on the landscape. But at the end of the day, you know, we're we get uh, we get the review and approval from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or the FERC, that really enables us to build a project that is beneficial, not just for the local community, but the region.
I couldn't agree with you more, quite frankly. The last question I want to ask you, we get to know quite a bit about the subject through this podcast, and certainly my knowledge base for pump storage is a lot broader after today's discussion than it was before, and I think that that'll be the case for a lot of folks too. But we don't always get to know the people behind it, right? And so I've gotten to know you a lot better. This is basically our first real conversation today. Do you have anything as kind of final parting words, any advice for people at home in general? I mean, whether it's career advice, whether it's advice about what we've been talking about today, or something completely different. I mean, what final words do you want to give to people at home that are encouraging and positive? And I apologize for putting you on the spot, but it's a fun way to get to know you a little bit better.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, just a couple of things I would think about there, that I could point out to listeners. Um, First, it's an easy time, or relatively easy time, if you're interested in renewable electricity, and the grid, vehicle electrification. I mean, there's a long list of things. We're going through a period of time, where the grid, and how we think about and use the grid, is changing dramatically. And so there's a lot of ways to get involved. And I think there's a lot of excitement there, whether you're, someone getting out of school and thinking about how they're going to spend their time in their career, or just, someone in the community that really wants to know more about where their electricity comes from, and ensuring that it's coming from local renewable sources in a cost effective way. So that's the one thing I point out. Assuming that most of our listeners in the Pacific Northwest, one thing that it's kind of funny, but I think we're often people in the Pacific Northwest can be a little bit shy about pointing out certain things, and certainly people in the Pacific Northwest should not be shy about pointing out, how low carbon our electricity system already is, and how, with relative ease, we'll be able to reach some of these really high goals of renewables, in a large part based on, a strong and resilient legacy hydropower system, adding wind and solar and pump storage, and continue to provide low cost, on demand resources for generations to come. So I think that's something that, most Pacific Northwest uh, residents know of, but don't often tout. And there are portions of the U.S. and far beyond the U.S. that are really grappling with how they're going to do this in a way that, is comparable, to what we've already done in the Pacific Northwest. And then I think, just to close on a comment specific to hydropower, we talk often in the Pacific Northwest about people on the west side or east side, or various communities, but it don't underestimate the ability of individuals to get excited about the idea that, the reservoirs in their community that they've grown up with, they've recreated on, maybe they understand they get their power from them for their homes, could be the source of fuel for their vehicle in the future. That is a powerful idea, especially for our communities that flank the Cascades. That their transportation fuel for their pickup truck or other vehicle really could be something as close to a water feature they recreate on in their backyard.
Well, I'll tell you what, I can't speak for everybody, but you've definitely got me a lot more excited today, and I really do appreciate that. It gives me a lot of encouragement for where this technology is headed and for where our grid is headed as a whole. So that's about all you could ask for out of a podcast going in depth on pump storage like this.
Great. Austin, I really appreciate the time today.
Thank you. I really appreciate your time as well. It's great to meet you. It's great to talk to you. And down the road we might be doing another one of these. I'm sure that things will continue to develop on this front, and it's a really exciting technology that is going to help us power towards the clean energy future. So, with that, we will wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, there you have it. Episode 2 of Damn is in the books, and I gotta say, this was a really interesting conversation. I'm sure Erik and I could talk a lot longer about the intricacies of the subject and pump storage, but that's all the time we had for this one. If you like what you heard today, come back every other Friday for new episodes of the podcast, and make sure to follow us at Northwest River Partners on your favorite social media platforms: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. You get the idea. You can also check us out on our website. That's nwriverpartners.org, nwriverpartners.org. And while you're there, hop on our email list to stay up to date as well with all the activities we got going on and what else we're releasing. As always, I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to listen, and we hope you'll join us on the next one. See ya!